Grantham was a quiet little town nestled among the green hills of Lincolnshire, England. It wasn't bustling or modern. Grantham lived in its own rhythm, slow footsteps, gentle breezes, and the occasional chime of a church bell echoing down its narrow lanes. Life here didn't see many disruptions, and perhaps because of that, the people of Grantham were quick to trust. They trusted neighbors, they trusted doctors, and of course, they trusted the nurses in white uniforms working inside the local hospital, the people they handed their children over to during moments of illness. Grantham and Kesteven Hospital stood quietly in the town center. It wasn't grand or modern, just a beige building with simple rectangular windows and an old tiled roof, as unassuming as the town itself. But for many families, it was a place of hope, a place where crying children with fevers or stubborn coughs were brought in and after a few days returned home smiling in their mother's arms. Inside the hospital on the third floor was the children's ward. It was a small space, just a few rooms, a nurse station, and a hallway lined with white tiles. The rooms were softly lit, with floral curtains, a few toys on shelves, and a television that played the same children's programs on repeat. Every day the ward echoed with the sounds of little voices, sometimes crying from injections, sometimes laughing during playtime. Nurses moved quickly, yet gently, with soft smiles, carrying bottles, thermometers, and clipboards, their footsteps clicking lightly against the linoleum floor. One nurse stood out among them, Beverly Allitt. She wasn't tall, round-faced, with a soft build and kind-looking eyes. Her brown hair was always tied neatly, and her smile seemed to calm even the fussiest babies. New mothers adored her. In the waiting room, whispers would pass between them. "Nurse Beverly is amazing. My baby wouldn't stop crying, and she calmed him down in less than a minute." Beverly often took the night shifts, those quiet hours with dimmed lights when only one or two nurses watched over a room full of sleeping infants. She never complained. In fact, she volunteered to work overtime, stayed past her scheduled hours, mopped floors, folded blankets, and tidied medical records. No one questioned her. Why would they? She was dependable, sweet, and always helpful. In the diary of a mother named Helen, she wrote, "I fell asleep around 3 a.m. When I opened my eyes, Beverly was standing by my baby's bed, gently fixing the blanket and touching his forehead." She smiled. In that moment, I felt truly grateful. In early February 1991, the hospital admitted a baby boy, Liam Taylor, just 7 weeks old. He had been brought in with mild breathing issues. Liam was the first child of Paul and Joanne, parents who had waited years for him. They were worried, but the doctors reassured them it was nothing serious and that a short hospital stay would suffice. Then, just 48 hours later, Liam went into cardiac arrest. No one understood what had happened. He had been stable, his vitals within normal range, but moments after a doctor left his room, the emergency alarm rang out. Beverly was the first on scene. She shouted code blue, initiated CPR, and called for help, but it was too late. Joanne arrived moments later, trembling, screaming down the hallway. Beverly wrapped her arms around the grieving mother, crying with her, whispering again and again, "I tried everything. I'm so sorry. I don't know what happened." No one suspected a thing. It was a tragic event, one of those unexplainable medical anomalies, and in their sorrow, the parents felt comforted by Beverly's presence. A few days later, another baby girl, Becky Phillips, only 2 months old, was admitted. She had a mild fever, not considered serious. The doctors once again reassured the family. She was placed in a room near the end of the corridor, where the lights were dimmer and only one nurse was on duty, Beverly. According to the medical notes, it had been a calm night, but by morning, Becky had deteriorated rapidly. Beverly called the doctors, but Becky couldn't be saved. Her cause of death was listed as unexplained, possibly sudden pneumonia. Once again, heads shook in sadness. Things took a darker turn when Becky's twin sister, Katie, was brought in the next day. Doctors, now slightly cautious, kept her under close observation. But during the night, even though she had shown no previous distress, Katie suddenly stopped breathing. This time, she was revived in time, but the damage was done. Katie had suffered permanent brain damage, lost her vision, and would never live a normal life. In just a few weeks, 3 healthy babies had suffered sudden medical emergencies. 2 were dead, 1 permanently disabled. And in all 3 cases, the common factor was crystal clear. Beverly Allitt had been the attending nurse. Yet during staff meetings, no one dared speak the suspicion aloud. They knew Beverly. They trusted Beverly. She volunteered for everything. She cried hardest at Liam's funeral. She continued to care for the other children with what appeared to be genuine love. It was unthinkable. Just as one would never question the love in a mother's eyes, no one questioned the kindness in Beverly's smile. One mother, Susan, whose child shared a room with Becky, later recalled, "I remember that night. My baby was crying and I walked out into the hallway. Beverly was sitting alone in the nurse's station. The lights were off and the glow from the monitors lit up her face. She didn't move. She was just staring out the window. When I approached, she blinked, then smiled and said, 'Is your little one sleeping okay?' I still remember that smile. Looking back, it chills me to the bone. But at the time, no one saw anything wrong. Beverly was a quiet nurse, maybe a bit shy, but kind and gentle. What danger could possibly come from someone like her? No one knew, no one imagined that what they were witnessing wasn't coincidence. These were not accidents, not misfortune. These were the deliberate acts of a person, committed in the very room where trust was placed without question. By late February, a junior doctor new to the hospital noticed something odd in Katie's records. Her insulin levels were alarmingly high, yet nowhere in the charts was insulin recorded as being administered. When he questioned Beverly, she shrugged and said it could have been a testing error, just one answer, just one moment. But from that point on, the doctor began keeping a private journal. The days after the first emergency in Ward 4 passed in uneasy silence, but peace was deceptive. Just a week after Liam Taylor's terrifying collapse, the quiet ward at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital was once again pierced by the shrill beep of alarms. This time, the target was Timothy Hardwick, an 11-year-old boy with cerebral palsy who had been admitted for mild seizure activity. He was stable, alert, even smiling when he arrived. A quiet boy who liked puzzles and hated loud noises. No one expected his heart to stop. It was Beverly who raised the alarm, Beverly who called out for help with panic in her voice. Doctors rushed in. Resuscitation began. But Timothy was unresponsive, his lips blue, his body limp. There was no clear cause. Doctors were confused. Children didn't just go into sudden cardiac arrest without a reason. Especially not ones like Timothy, who had no serious health complications. The team revived him, barely, but the damage was done. Timothy never regained consciousness. He was moved to intensive care and later pronounced brain dead. Everyone was shaken. Parents whispered in the hallways. Nurses looked at one another with silent, worried eyes, but there were no answers. And then came the next case. Just a day later, Becky Phillips, a baby only 2 months old, was admitted with a stomach virus. She was cranky, feverish, and needed fluids, but she was not in danger. She cried when her mother handed her to the nurses. Beverly Allitt was assigned to her care. At midnight, the hospital called Becky's parents. Their baby had suddenly gone into respiratory arrest. Doctors managed to revive her, but she was weak, and something about the whole episode felt wrong. The next morning, the baby seemed better. She was breathing on her own again. Her color returned, so the doctors discharged her. That night, Becky was back home with her parents when she screamed one long, high-pitched cry and died in her sleep. The official cause, sudden infant death syndrome. The parents were devastated. And once again, no one suspected the nurse. Why would they? Beverly Allitt had a way about her. She was quiet but helpful. She often volunteered for extra shifts. She stayed late. She brought tea to parents sitting by their child's bed. She knew how to smile at the right moment. To doctors, she was reliable. To families, she was comforting. But behind the soft-spoken presence was something darker, something beginning to stir, and it wasn't over yet. A few days after Becky's death, her twin sister, Katie Phillips, was brought to the hospital just to be safe. Their parents were terrified. They didn't want to lose another child. Doctors saw no symptoms. Katie was healthy. But once again, Beverly was assigned to her care. Katie collapsed in the early morning hours, then again later that night. Each time, Beverly was nearby. Each time, the alarms didn't go off right away. Each time, the baby was revived, but barely. After the second attack, doctors decided to move Katie to another hospital for more tests. It was only after she left Grantham that her condition stabilized. And yet nobody sounded the alarm. No one connected the dots. Not yet. More children came. More emergencies followed. 5-month-old Claire Peck came in for asthma. Her breathing was labored but not critical. Shortly after being left alone with Beverly, Claire stopped breathing. She was revived, then left alone again, and stopped breathing again, this time fatally. Each case seemed separate. Each child had their own condition. Doctors told themselves it was just a terrible coincidence, but there was a pattern. Children who shouldn't have died did. Children who shouldn't have collapsed did, and Beverly Allitt was there every single time. Among the staff, whispers began to grow. Nurses who once trusted Beverly now watched her from the corners of their eyes. "She always happens to be there," one said quietly. "It's strange, isn't it?" another muttered. But no one dared accuse a fellow nurse outright. To suggest that someone was harming children in a hospital, it was unthinkable, unbearable, and Beverly knew it. She knew how to play the part. She knew when to cry with parents, when to stand silently beside doctors, when to offer a tissue or a gentle nod. She knew how to hide. Then came Paul Crampton, a 5-month-old baby admitted for a minor chest infection. He collapsed 3 times in a single day. Doctors were baffled. Paul was healthy. He had no history of illness that could cause such a rapid decline. The 3rd time, doctors moved him immediately to a specialist hospital. It started with whispers, nothing loud, nothing clear, just quiet conversations behind closed office doors, subtle exchanges between nurses during breaks, a look exchanged between doctors who, for the first time in a long while, had no words. The children's ward at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital was no longer just a place of healing. It had become a place of quiet dread. The pediatric staff were walking through hallways lined with invisible questions. Too many emergencies. Too many unexplained crises, and always somehow Nurse Beverly Allitt was there, but still no one wanted to believe it. At first there was sympathy. Beverly had been present during traumatic events. She had witnessed the deaths of innocent children. That left a mark. It had to. The stress, the heartbreak, it wore down even the most experienced nurse. But then, the patterns, it was consultant pediatrician Dr. Nelson Porter who first found himself trapped in the web of doubts. He'd seen medical anomalies before, but never like this. One child after another collapsing without warning, recovering, collapsing again, then dying. Children who had been doing well suddenly turning pale, breathless, still. And in every file, in every emergency report, there it was, Nurse Allitt present. He tried to dismiss it, blaming infection, faulty monitors, underlying conditions. But inside, something uneasy took root. Then came the case of baby Claire Peck. Claire was a bright 2-month-old with breathing issues but a hopeful prognosis. She was placed on a ventilator, closely monitored. For hours, she did well. Until Beverly took over her care. Moments later, Claire went into cardiac arrest. She was revived, but soon after, arrested again, fatally this time. The hospital was devastated. Her parents were inconsolable. Dr. Porter studied Claire's chart long into the night. the oxygen levels, the time logs, the medication chart. He turned page after page until the truth started whispering to him. The numbers didn't lie, neither did the presence of Beverly. Still, it wasn't enough. Hospitals are slow machines when it comes to suspicion, especially against their own. The idea that a nurse, one who had cared for dying children, comforted grieving parents, worked long, painful hours, could be harming patients. It was unthinkable, but unthinkable things were happening. Porter began asking questions, softly at first. He spoke with staff. He reviewed other recent cases: Liam Taylor, Becky Phillips, Timothy Hardwick, Paul Crampton. All collapsed under mysterious circumstances, all under Beverly's watch. A meeting was called: senior hospital staff, risk managers. The tone was guarded, professional. But underneath, anxiety bloomed like mold on damp walls. They couldn't prove anything yet, but they knew what they feared. Soon after, hospital administrators contacted Lincolnshire police. They needed to know, quietly, carefully, if they were dealing with a pattern or a coincidence. The police assigned a detective inspector. A preliminary review began. Behind closed doors, records were pulled. Medical charts were reanalyzed. Time logs were rechecked. One nurse's name appeared again and again. But still, it wasn't easy. Beverly had always appeared competent, calm, caring, a nurse who cried when children died, who held grieving mothers close, who showed up to every shift, who never broke. In fact, she seemed too calm. That bothered them more. As the hospital's internal concerns deepened, Detective Superintendent Stuart Clifton was brought in to lead a full-scale investigation. By now, whispers had become murmurs. A special investigative team was formed. Every case in the children's ward over the previous 2 months would be reviewed. Files were boxed, numbered, laid out in cold rows under fluorescent lights. This was no longer just a matter of suspicion. It was becoming a matter of evidence. Clifton wasn't a man who rushed to judgment. But as he and his team read through the clinical data, the sequence of collapses, the erratic heart rates, the sudden drops in blood sugar, they began to see a terrifying picture take shape. In most cases, the children had been fine, stable, often on the path to recovery, until Beverly came into the room. Then inexplicably they stopped breathing. Their hearts failed, some were saved, others weren't. Autopsies were ordered. Lab samples tested again. In the body of one infant, traces of insulin were found, massive, unprescribed amounts. In another, excessive potassium. Neither had been administered by any doctor, and both substances can cause death in a child. The question became urgent: who would have access, who was present? The answer, over and over, was Beverly Allitt. The team moved carefully. They didn't want to alert her. Surveillance was considered. Every action she took was monitored. But Beverly continued to play her role perfectly, quiet, helpful, professional, even as she was unknowingly surrounded by investigators. But the evidence was piling up. Soon, the police were ready. A decision was made to confront her. In March 1991, just weeks after the last emergency on the ward, Beverly was called in for questioning. She didn't panic. She didn't shout. She simply sat across from the officers and answered their questions softly. She denied everything. She was caring. She was attentive. She did her job. She didn't know why so many children had died. She too was grieving. But even as she spoke, detectives noted something strange. Her body language was closed. Her tone measured, not defensive, not outraged, just practiced. When asked about the insulin levels, she offered no explanation. When asked why she was present at nearly every incident, she shrugged. Maybe I was just unlucky. She seemed almost proud of her composure. The investigators left that first interview with more questions than answers, but also with a chilling certainty. Beverly Allitt was not the small ward in Grantham had begun to breathe again. After the sudden transfer of nurse Beverly Allitt, the atmosphere, once heavy with dread, seemed to ease. It wasn't a complete return to peace, but the pattern of suffering had stopped. No more unexplained arrests in breathing. No sudden crashes, no mysterious deaths. The doctors noticed, the nurses noticed, and the parents, though still grieving, noticed too. But that peace was deceptive. It was only the eye of the storm. Dr. Nelson Porter, a pediatric consultant at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital, had never considered himself a man easily shaken. But something about the past weeks haunted him. Even in the silence of his office, the echoes of beeping monitors and flat lines lingered. He began reviewing cases one by one, not just the children who had died, but those who had nearly joined them. He wrote their names down. Liam Taylor, Timothy Hardwick, Kaylee Desmond, Becky Phillip, Katie Phillip, Claire Peck, Paul Crampton, Bradley Gibson, Yik Hung Chan, Michael Davidson. The list grew. He began to notice something chilling. These children, so different in age and illness, had something in common beyond their suffering. They had all been under the care of Beverly Allitt. Becky Phillips had come into the ward with nothing more than a minor chest infection. She was only 2 months old. Her twin sister, Katie, followed shortly after when Becky became inexplicably ill. Becky died on the ward. The cause was unclear. Cardiac arrest, they said. Katie, despite being healthy, had a seizure after her sister's death. She was transferred to a different hospital for safety. At Queen's Medical Center, doctors found something horrifying: air bubbles in her brain. A telltale sign of insulin overdose. Katie survived, but not without consequences. She was left blind and severely brain damaged. The question doctors began to ask was simple. Why would a healthy baby suddenly have insulin in her system? It wasn't a single incident that prompted the hospital to act. It was the weight of coincidence. The hospital launched an internal investigation. The medical director, alongside Dr. Porter, met behind closed doors to comb through records, staffing schedules, drug charts. Insulin levels were tested retroactively. Strange entries were discovered in the hospital's controlled drug records. Medications were missing, potent ones: insulin, potassium chloride, lignocaine. On paper, Beverly Allitt was a model nurse. She was polite, always willing to take extra shifts, always present when things went wrong. But that, too, was the problem. She was always there. It was often the voices of mothers that didn't make it into official reports. But in this case, one mother refused to stay silent. Sue Phillips, the mother of Becky and Katie, had trusted Beverly. She remembered the nurse's soft voice, the way she cradled Becky with tenderness. But in hindsight, that tenderness now felt cold, performed, mechanical. After Katie's brain scans revealed signs of trauma, Sue felt a shift inside her, a crack in trust that turned into fury. When she learned that both daughters had been alone with Beverly during their critical moments, she demanded answers, not in whispers, not in grief, but with fire. By early summer 1991, the case could no longer be contained. The hospital notified Lincolnshire police, and a formal criminal investigation was launched. Detective Superintendent Stuart Clifton was assigned, calm, methodical, and painfully aware that he was entering uncharted territory. What kind of investigation was this? A string of infant deaths, no clear crime scene, no weapons, no witnesses, only a trail of silence left behind in hospital charts and grieving parents. There was no blood, no bruises. The children died of what appeared to be natural causes, until forensics began looking deeper. Blood samples from surviving children were reanalyzed. Several showed dangerously high levels of insulin, despite no medical reason for the hormone to be administered. In the case of Paul Crampton, doctors had been baffled by 3 near-death episodes in just 3 days. But the insulin levels in his blood left no room for confusion. He had been poisoned. The weapon had no shape, no sound. It was delivered through syringes, silent, invisible, and someone with access had done it. In the early stages, Beverly wasn't a suspect in the traditional sense. She wasn't arrested, she wasn't even accused, but she was watched. Police reviewed dozens of hours of hospital CCTV, patient records, interviews with staff. And again, her name appeared again and again in connection to each unexplained event. A nurse who volunteered for extra shifts. A nurse who was present each time tragedy struck. A nurse who comforted parents, then returned to the nurse's station, stone-faced. What disturbed detectives most was how ordinary she seemed. There was no outward sign of malice. No history of violence, just an eerie calm. The first time detectives visited her family home in Corby Glen, it was quiet. Her parents welcomed officers politely. Beverly appeared calm, if not slightly withdrawn. Her bedroom was tidy. On the walls were medical posters, nursing certificates, and stuffed animals. Her notebooks contained drawings, lists of baby names, and diary entries. Some pages were innocent, others weren't. In the margins of a nurse training manual, someone, presumably Beverly, had scribbled medication names, KCL, insulin, digoxin, dosages, notes, side effects. To most, it would seem like study notes. But to the detectives, it was a blueprint. By September 1991, pressure mounted to make an arrest, but the case was delicate. If they moved too early, they risked losing everything. They needed a confession or damning evidence. So they invited Beverly in for voluntary interviews. At first, she was cooperative, quiet, soft-spoken. She denied everything, but her answers were vague, contradictory. She couldn't explain why she had been alone during key moments. She couldn't recall which medication she administered. Then, on her fourth interview, she changed. Just days after a particularly intense interrogation, Beverly collapsed in her cell. She claimed she was sick. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors couldn't find anything physically wrong. This was not the first time. Throughout her life, Beverly had a long history of mystery illnesses, sudden abdominal pain, fainting. Seizures. Each time, tests returned inconclusive. Some doctors suspected Munchausen's syndrome, a psychological disorder in which a person fakes illness to gain attention. Now, detectives began to wonder. Had this need for attention extended to harming others? On November 1991, after months of meticulous investigation, police had gathered enough. Beverly Allitt was arrested. There was something about Beverly Allitt that haunted those who knew her. Not just the things she had done, the crimes, the deception, the pain she inflicted on the innocent, but the way she looked so ordinary while doing it. In court, she wore the same pale expression she had in the hospital, quiet, reserved, almost childlike. Her voice was soft, her eyes distant. She didn't look like a monster. She looked like a nurse who had simply seen too much. And for a while, that's how many people explained her: overwhelmed, burned out, emotionally exhausted. But the truth ran deeper than stress or fatigue. It went back to something much older and much more disturbing. Long before Beverly became known as the Angel of Death, she had already begun to shape a world where she was always at the center of attention, a world where illness, injury, and tragedy circled her like satellites. Former teachers remembered a girl who sometimes wore bandages without wounds, who claimed to suffer from strange health conditions, but never stayed long enough in school for anyone to confirm it. Friends from her teen years recalled frequent hospital visits, some real, most not. Her medical records revealed a tangled web of symptoms: stomach pains, seizures, blurred vision, even leukemia. But doctors could never find clear evidence for any of it. Some saw her as unlucky. Others quietly suspected she was exaggerating. What no one dared to say out loud, not then, was the possibility that she wanted to be ill. That she needed to be. During her trial, a team of forensic psychologists was assigned to evaluate Beverly Allitt. Their task wasn't just to determine if she understood right from wrong, but to dig into the question that hovered like a dark cloud over the courtroom. Why would a nurse hurt children? The answer they proposed shocked many, and yet, when examined closely, it made a terrible kind of sense. They diagnosed her with Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a rare and deeply troubling psychological disorder where a caregiver fabricates or induces illness in those under their care in order to gain attention, sympathy, or praise. In Beverly's case, the victims were the children in Ward 4, but the intended audience was much broader: the other nurses, the doctors, the parents, the community. She positioned herself as the one who was always there when tragedy struck. She called for help, she performed CPR, she stayed by the child's side during the code blue. Often she was praised for her quick response, even when the outcome was tragic. Even in the face of death, she looked like the hero. There's a chilling question at the center of Beverly's story. Did she know exactly what she was doing, or was she lost in her own delusion? Some psychologists believed that Beverly's actions were calculated, perhaps not in a cold, strategic way, but guided by a deep need to be needed. A hunger for validation, a craving for importance that she couldn't find in any other way. Others believed she may have lost her grip on reality entirely, that she convinced herself these children were sick, that she was saving them, even when she was the one making them worse. But the cold facts remained. Insulin doesn't accidentally appear in a healthy baby's bloodstream. Air doesn't just find its way into a drip line, and heart monitors don't flatline by coincidence. What Beverly did required planning, timing, and opportunity. It required access to controlled substances. It required knowing just how much harm to cause and when. That pointed to a kind of intent no diagnosis could fully explain. The court ruled that Beverly was mentally unwell but not insane. She understood the nature and consequences of her actions. She knew what she did was wrong, but she did it anyway. Her sentencing reflected that conclusion. She was found guilty on 13 counts of serious harm, including 4 counts of murder. The judge gave her 13 life sentences, with a recommendation that she never be released. She was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric institution in Nottinghamshire. There, behind walls lined with cameras and steel doors, Beverly Allitt faded into obscurity. But the questions she left behind never faded. Many wonder, how did no one stop her sooner? How did so many warning signs go unnoticed? But the even more difficult question is, how many people like her have been missed? How many caregivers, trusted and gentle on the outside, carry something broken within, a void so deep that they're willing to harm those they're meant to protect just to feel important? Psychiatrists and criminologists continue to study cases like Beverly's, not just to understand them, but to prevent the next one. Her name appears now in medical textbooks and lectures as a warning, a case study. The courtroom was silent, only the rustle of papers, the occasional squeak of a chair, and the low murmur of voices filled the air. After months of investigation, heartbreak, and revelation, Beverly Allitt was finally brought to trial. And now justice would try to catch up to what had already been lost. She entered the dock not in a nurse's uniform, but in plain civilian clothes. Her face was calm, blank almost. To the families who had once trusted her, it was chilling. One by one, the charges were read aloud: 4 counts of murder, 11 counts of attempted murder, 11 counts of grievous bodily harm. Each name echoed through the courtroom like a bell of mourning: Liam Taylor, Timothy Hardwick, Becky Phillips, Claire Peck, and so many others who had narrowly survived. The prosecution painted a terrifying portrait. They said Beverly was someone who thrived on chaos, who harmed children just to be seen as their savior. They called her acts cold, calculated, and callous, but they didn't shout. They didn't need to. The evidence did the talking. Medical records were laid out, showing impossible combinations of symptoms. Witnesses described the sudden collapses, the patterns no one had seen before. Experts explained how insulin and potassium could be used to stop a heart without leaving obvious clues. Then came the tapes, security footage, interviews, and perhaps most chilling, Beverly's own notes and behaviors. Moments where she inserted herself into grieving families' lives, offering condolences, hugging mothers, visiting sick children long after her shift had ended. Some families had still wanted to believe in her, but now even they struggled to reconcile the smiling nurse they had known with the woman accused of taking their children from them. Her defense team argued she was mentally unwell. They said she had Munchausen syndrome by proxy, that she hurt children to draw attention to herself, to gain praise and sympathy. They pleaded not for her innocence, but for understanding. Psychiatrists supported this. They said she had a severe personality disorder, that she showed traits of narcissism, manipulation, and a craving for attention so deep it turned lethal. She didn't want the children dead, they said. She wanted them to be close to death, just enough to be rescued so she could be the hero. But in several cases she had gone too far. Some journalists began calling her the nurse from hell. Others used the nickname that stuck, the Angel of Death. The trial lasted nearly 2 months. The public was torn. Some were shocked that such evil could exist in the form of a kind-looking young woman. Others were angry that no one had noticed sooner. No hospital alarm, no coworker's suspicion, no medical review had stopped her. Questions were raised. How could this happen in a modern hospital? Why weren't the signs seen earlier? Were there more victims that never came forward? Parents of the survivors came to court every day. Some wept silently. Some stared blankly at the floor. A few in private interviews admitted they felt guilty for trusting her, for not seeing it, for letting their child be in her care. But there were no easy answers, and there was no way to rewind time. When it was Beverly's turn to speak, she said very little. No apology, no explanation. Her lawyers spoke on her behalf. She stared straight ahead, her expression unreadable. On May 23, 1993, the verdict was announced. Guilty. Beverly Allitt was convicted on 13 counts of serious harm to children, 4 of them fatal. The judge sentenced her to 13 life sentences, and she was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility. The judge described her crimes as grave and evil beyond belief. He called her a danger to society and said she showed a chilling lack of remorse. Many expected her to be transferred to a prison eventually, but because of her mental health diagnosis, she remained in the hospital under close supervision. The public wasn't satisfied. To them, a hospital sounded too soft, too kind for what she had done. Still, justice, however imperfect, had arrived. Outside the courtroom, parents stood together. They didn't cheer, they didn't smile. Some of them clutched photos of their children, some lit candles. One father was asked by a reporter how he felt. He paused, looked into the camera, and said, "This doesn't bring my son back, but maybe now another child will be safe." Beverly Allitt's case didn't just end with a sentence. It started a storm. Hospitals across the UK began reviewing their internal policies. Pediatric units introduced stricter monitoring, especially regarding medication. Staff were retrained. Supervisors became more involved in death reviews. A culture of silence and hierarchy was challenged. Nurses were no longer allowed to work long, unsupervised shifts without peer oversight. Patient logs were cross-checked more thoroughly, and reports of unusual deaths, once buried in paperwork, were escalated faster. Yet the fear remained. Could this happen again? It was a hard question. Because Beverly Allitt had slipped through the cracks, not because no one cared, but because no one imagined a nurse could do such harm. She had weaponized trust. Years passed, but for the families, the wounds remained. Some parents changed careers. Others dedicated their lives to charity or medical safety reform. A few wrote books, hoping that telling their child's story might protect others. Survivors like Katie Phillips, who had been left with lasting disabilities, grew up with shadows cast over their earliest years. They lived with both the pain and the strength of having survived something unspeakable. For many, life moved forward but never moved on. The trial of Beverly Allitt began in February 1993 at Nottingham Crown Court. The courtroom was filled with a tense silence that never quite lifted. Parents of victims sat in quiet sorrow. Reporters lined the aisles, pens poised, and Beverly, calm, blank-faced, dressed in soft pastels, sat at the center of it all, seemingly untouched by the emotional storm swirling around her. She faced 17 charges. 4 counts of murder, 11 of attempted murder, and 2 of causing grievous bodily harm. The evidence, though largely circumstantial, painted a chilling pattern: children suddenly deteriorating under her care, unexplained levels of insulin or potassium in their systems, and cardiac arrests that aligned almost perfectly with Beverly's shifts. The prosecution built a compelling timeline. They showed how the attacks on children always happened when Beverly was alone with them. They demonstrated how resuscitation equipment had been tampered with. They revealed that insulin doses found in victims like Becky Phillips and Katie Phillips were so high they could not have been accidental. Witnesses included doctors, nurses, forensic experts, and most hauntingly, parents. Their testimonies came heavy with emotion, often breaking down mid-sentence. Some brought photos of their lost children, holding them like talismans. Others stared straight at Beverly, hoping to find answers in her eyes, but they found nothing. Beverly pleaded not guilty to all charges. Her defense team argued she suffered from a severe mental disorder, Munchausen syndrome by proxy. They claimed she harmed the children not out of malice, but to gain attention and sympathy, especially from her colleagues. She wanted to be seen as a hero, they said, the nurse who always happened to be there, the one who tried to save them, but even that explanation felt hollow to many. Psychiatrists were divided. Some agreed she suffered from a personality disorder. Others believed she was fully aware of her actions and had chosen to commit them regardless of consequence. The jury deliberated for 6 days, and then the verdict came: guilty. Beverly Allitt was convicted on 13 of the 17 counts, including 4 murders. The judge, Mr. Justice Latham, called her actions serious and grave crimes of calculated evil and sentenced her to 13 life terms. He recommended that she never be released, but rather than serving time in a standard prison, Beverly was sent to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility. The public's reaction was one of outrage. Many believed she was escaping justice, receiving treatment instead of punishment. Parents of victims, in particular, were devastated. They wanted her to spend her life behind bars, not in what they perceived as a place of relative comfort. The media dubbed her the Angel of Death, but in truth, there was nothing angelic about what she had done. The aftermath of Beverly's trial rippled through the medical system. An independent inquiry was launched into how such horrific events could unfold undetected in a modern hospital. How could no one notice that death seemed to follow a single nurse? The report found systemic failures. Poor communication, a lack of proper incident tracking, and a general reluctance to suspect a healthcare worker of wrongdoing. There were missed warnings, overlooked signs, and a blind trust in uniform. Hospital protocols across the UK were tightened. Pediatric wards began implementing stricter monitoring of medication and staff behavior. Nurses no longer worked alone with high-risk patients. Deaths in children's wards were now reviewed with far more scrutiny, but for the families affected by Beverly's crimes, no amount of reform could heal the wounds. They were left with empty beds, birthdays uncelebrated, and memories frozen in time. Some families set up charities in the names of their children, others retreated into quiet grief, and some, even years later, still visited the graves of those lost in Ward 4, whispering the names of the children Beverly Allitt had taken from them. Beverly remains in Rampton Hospital, her hair now graying, her demeanor subdued. She rarely speaks to visitors. Rumors suggest she still claims her innocence. She reportedly requested parole in later years, each time denied. She will likely die behind hospital walls, far from the lives she shattered, and yet her name still lingers in the minds of many, as a warning, as a ghost, as a symbol of trust betrayed. If this story haunted you the way it haunted the nation, if you believe justice must always be seen and heard, subscribe to Rose and Crimes. We uncover the darkest